So I have a message that I want to give to Joe Biden, and I'm going to deliver that here in just a second. CNBC is reporting that the Supreme Court is likely to rule that Biden's student loan plan is illegal. So in other words, the student loan debt reduction that Biden announced and he signed an executive order on, there are now signs that the Supreme Court is going to slap that down and say this is unconstitutional. Now, one of the pieces of evidence to that effect is that Biden asked for a stay on the lower court's opinion. So in other words, like, let these people sign up for the student loan debt reduction, let us give out the student loan debt reduction as you are contemplating whether or not this is constitutional and allowed. So they asked for that. They asked for, hey, while we're hearing the case here, while we're hearing the arguments, at least let people move forward with the student loan debt reduction. And the Supreme Court said no. So they say the Supreme Court will decide whether or not the president's debt relief policy causes harm to the plaintiffs or is an overreach of executive authority. Legal experts say the Supreme Court is likely to end the forgiveness plan given its conservative majority. Long before the president acted, Republicans had criticized student loan forgiveness as a handout to well-off college graduates. Total horseshit. Total horseshit. 90% of the relief goes to people who make $75,000 a year or less. This squarely helps the working class. And it does even more, for the lower you are on the income ladder, the more help you get. Like Pell Grant recipients get up to $20,000 eliminated. Everybody else gets up to $10,000. The only people who were excluded, again, because of the lawsuits, not because Biden left them out, because there were suits and they were going to win those suits over the private companies that were involved in this. So they dropped the relief for them. And then also there's another phenomenal provision that's capped the amount that you could pay per month at, I think it was 5%. I think it was 5%, which really would have helped people a lot. So lower courts have slapped this down. By the way, make no mistake about it, those courts were ruthlessly partisan. This isn't like very serious scholars reading the law and interpreting it objectively. No, this is like partisan right-wing hacks who were like, we don't like this, so we're going to go ahead and slap it down. Now, there's a few things to say about this. Number one, the way Joe Biden did it was in keeping with what had been happening during COVID. So during COVID, and Trump did this too. Trump announced, hey, we're going to pause the student loan debt stuff, and we're going to, I'm going to eliminate some people's student loan debt. So I think for Trump, he picked like, I don't know, disabled veterans. There was like a small group that he was like, we're going to get rid of your student loan debt. Biden continued that a few times. He extended it to other groups, continued the pause on the student loan debt, and then he announced this big relief. And the way he did it was using the COVID justification. Now, I told you at the time, I don't like this justification because it seems more shaky legally. But to be fair, it is the same justification that, Trump had used and he had used previously, and there were no problems previously, so we thought, well, maybe this is the best way to do it, right? But there is a better way to do it. There is a better way to do it, and that is the 1965 Higher Education Act. So does Biden have the authority to do this? Well, yes, I think he does. The way he did it, I think, was legal and fair, but the courts might strike that down. So what Biden should do is come back, even if the Supreme Court slaps it down, come back and say, no, I'm just going to do it again using the 1965 Higher Education Act. Because we know under that act, he has the authority. The Secretary of Education has the authority to do this. So here, I'll give you guys the legal case.
I'm going to talk about one simple question. Is it legal for President Biden to cancel student debt? The answer is yes. He can do it today without any other action by Congress. Let me explain why. Imagine you lend me $20. It's your $20. You can ask me to pay it back in full, in half, or not at all. Student debt cancellation works the same way. When someone takes out a federal student loan, they're borrowing money from the government, and the Constitution gives Congress the authority to control property of the government, such as debts owed to it. When Congress gave the Secretary of Education the authority to make or back student loans, it also gave the Secretary the broad and unrestricted power to cancel or write down that debt. This power was established under the Higher Education Act in 1965. That law gives the Secretary of Education the authority to compromise, waive, or release any right, title, claim, lien, or demand, however acquired. The Secretary also has the authority not simply to compromise debt, but to modify a student loan to zero. Secretary Betsy DeVos actually used this authority to cancel out a limited amount of student debt. Now, it's important to understand the purpose of the Higher Education Act. It was to make the benefits of higher education widely available, especially to those who otherwise couldn't afford it. Nobody else but the federal government was willing to lend to people with no credit history, no means, and only the chance at a bright future. But we decided to do it because education is so important to us as individuals and as a country. But the intent was not what we're seeing now. Worsening the racial wealth gap, driving up costs, reducing affordability and access, and triggering a repayment crisis. The nation today has a $1.7 trillion student debt burden owed to the federal government by about 43 million Americans. At the Project on Predatory Student Lending, we represent over 1 million student borrowers who were cheated by for-profit colleges. And this is an industry that aggressively targets and scams people who are looking for jobs and careers in order to get its hands on federal student loan dollars. Their priority is enrollment, not education. We see how defaulting on student debt can cause poor credit, food insecurity, homelessness, inability to pay household debt, barriers to employment, and mental and physical health issues. It holds people back in their decisions to get married and have children or to do certain kinds of jobs that we as a country need doing. And this burden impacts the whole family, the whole community, the whole economy, not just the loan bearer. But we've also seen how debt cancellation can liberate Americans and their families. And with the COVID-19 pandemic, the government has paused federal student loan payments through September 2021. This has freed up households in this pandemic to spend money and help keep our economy going. And the ability to do that falls under the same authority to modify or outright cancel debts. In these examples and others, the law is clear. President Biden has the legal authority to cancel student debt. And doing so is not an end, but a beginning of necessary change we need to invest in higher education in a different way so that millions more Americans are not cheated out of their futures and saddled with student debt that they can never repay.
There it is. He has the legal authority to do it. Now, the way he tried to do it, I think was still legitimate, but it looks like they're going to slap it down. Now, does this mean, because there's a theory out there that, well, he wanted it to get slapped down. At first, I thought that was possible. Like, yeah, maybe he does, which is why he did it in this weird way. But this was the authority they had used previously and successfully. So, and Trump used it too. So, I don't think that that's the case, especially since every time they've lost, they appealed. So if they wanted it to get slapped down, they could have just, as soon as they took one L, they could have said, we're going to lose all this and we're not going forward. They did that with the private loans specifically because they thought, look, we have the losing legal arguments. We're going to drop it there. But for 40 million people, they're appealing. They keep appealing because they're actually fighting for it. Okay, so now we know Biden actually is committed to doing this, right? Especially if he wants to run in 2024 and wants to win, he better get this through. This is one of his main accomplishments, right? So here's my message to President Biden. Let's say the Supreme Court slaps down your student loan debt reduction and says the legal way you did it is not correct. Now, I think they'd be wrong to do that, but they very well may do that. Now there's hints that they will do that, okay? Well, then you turn around and you say, okay, then I'm just going to do the exact same executive order. I mean, I would like it if he got rid of all of it, which he can do, but I'm going to use the 1965 Higher Education Act, which clearly gives the authority to do whatever we want with these loans, because we hold the debt. Federal government holds the debt. I'm the head of the executive branch. I'm the head of the government, right? We're going to use the 1965 Higher Education Act to do the same thing. The Secretary of Education is going to eliminate it. But there's also another part to it, which makes it so that, because the Supreme Court is a rogue Supreme Court. They are activist judges. They don't care what the plain face reading of the law is if it goes against their politics and their opinions. So they would probably slap that down too. If they slap it down this time, they might slap that down too. So what do? How do you fight back? The answer is very simple. There's a part of the Constitution about court stripping. I don't know how many of you have heard that term before. Court stripping. So this is in an article in the American Prospect. And here's what they say. This is David Dayen's outlet. We need a deeper reform, one that the Constitution specifically authorizes. Article 3 of the Constitution gives Congress the power to strip federal courts' jurisdiction. a power that can be employed to rein in politicized courts and even to override judges when they stand in the way of change that a substantial and enduring political majority wants. How would jurisdiction stripping work? Article 3, Section 1 gives Congress complete discretion on whether to create the lower federal courts, a power that Congress has used from the founding to limit lower courts' jurisdiction. And Article 3, Section 2, Clause 2 explicitly empowers Congress to make, quote, exceptions to the Supreme Court's appellate jurisdiction. That is, to pick and choose with approximately 99% of the Supreme Court's total docket what cases the court has the power to hear. This is something you probably have never heard of. The Constitution gives the authority to Congress to limit the scope of what the courts, including the Supreme Court, can look at. Don't believe me? Article 3, Section 2, Clause 2 of the U.S. Constitution. In all cases affecting ambassadors, other public ministers and consuls, and those in which a state shall be party, the Supreme Court shall have original jurisdiction. In all other cases before mentioned, the Supreme Court shall have appellate jurisdiction, both as to law and fact, with such exceptions as under such regulations as the Congress shall make. With such exceptions and under such regulations as the Congress shall make. A lot of people don't know this history, but in the 1980s, Ronald Reagan and his right-wing majority, they were looking into court stripping. And they decided, well, what if we take our agenda, we pass it through the House, we pass it through the Senate, and we put court stripping provisions on every piece of our legislation. Then the Supreme Court has no recourse. So they can't say, you're not allowed to do this because we declare it's unconstitutional under judicial review. The Congress is legally allowed, is constitutionally allowed to limit the scope of what the Supreme Court could look at. So you could say, we're passing this, and we hereby declare this is not going to be within the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court to overrule it. You can do that. You absolutely can do that. So it says right here, with such exceptions and under such regulations as the Congress shall make. So just add a regulation. The Supreme Court can't rule on this. So if I was Joe Biden, here's my message to him. Looks like they're going to overturn your student loan debt reduction. Now, that's bullshit. I think even the way he did it, even though it was more questionable, it's still legal. I think it's still legal. They're going to overturn it. Biden should turn around, sign another executive order, the same executive order. I would go further and get rid of all the student loan debt reduction, and get rid of all the student loan debt. But let's say he doesn't do that. Okay, sign the exact same executive order and say, under the 1965 Higher Education Act, the federal government has the clear authority to eliminate this debt. We hold 90% of the student loan debt. It's ours. We can do whatever the fuck we want with it. You have to say that in the executive order. You don't have to curse in the executive order, but we're going to get rid of it. And also, if the Supreme Court overrules the plain-faced reading, the plain-faced text of this law, of this action, then we will invoke Article 3, Section 2, Clause 2, and strip the court of its jurisdiction, strip the court of its authority on this issue. That's what he needs to do. And honestly, he should be making some phone calls to the Supreme Court and letting them know, you're on fucking thin ice. Because again, they are overruling, even with this case, they're overruling a very straight, reasonable interpretation of the law. So, and it would be an even more straightforward interpretation if he invokes the 1965 Higher Education Act. It is very clear they have the authority to do this. So if the rogue, tyrannical, authoritarian Supreme Court strikes this down, then you do it again, you do it under the 1965 Higher Education Act, and you say, you better get the fuck in line. And we're going to invoke court stripping to make sure you can't crush this thing, because you're an activist court. Clearly you don't care about the plain face reading of the law. Clearly you are Federalist Society goons who will take literally any and all things that are good that the government does and say, you're not allowed to do that, because we declare, because that's our reading of the Constitution. So basically we have judicial tyranny in this country if they keep overturning popular things. If they keep overturning things that clearly the president has the authority to do. This was never a problem before. Reducing student loan debt or eliminating it here and there for different groups of people, there's never a fucking problem. There was never a problem. It was clearly legal because they already have the authority to do it. Now all of a sudden, oh no, you're not allowed to do that. So if they overturn it, which they might, this is what Biden needs to do. because you can't have one of your main accomplishments get slapped down and then you go whimpering into the night. You think FDR would have gone whimpering into the night? No, he fought the court. Just the threat of packing the court made the court allow the New Deal through. There are times in American history where the court has overreached. Go read about Plessy versus Ferguson. And that was the court thinking they were heroes stepping in. Go read about it. There are times Abraham Lincoln had to be like, I'm just ignoring you, the court, because, okay, stop me with your army. Oh, that's right, bitch. You don't have an army. And you're overreaching. This is not within your authority. So they're overstepping. They already overstepped with Roe versus Wade. If they overstep again, you better invoke court stripping, and you better do the same reduction under the 1965 Higher Education Act. Look, I believe he does want this to stand. He does want a student loan debt reduction to stand. He does. Which is why they're appealing every time they lose. But you got to show some fight. You have to fight for it. You have to fight for it. And this is the way you fight for it. If you want to see me and Crystal Ball interview legends like Noam Chomsky, Cornel West, and more, subscribe to Crystal, Kyle, and Friends on Substack. $5 a month gets you the video version a day early. Remember, we take 0 ad dollars for this podcast. Or you can sign up on Substack for free and get the audio version a day later. Link in the video description box below.